Hi, I'm Dr. Hackie Reitman. Welcome to another episode of Exploring Different Brains. And this guy today I want you to meet. I was so excited when I started reading about him and I contacted him and I said, wow, a modern day Renaissance man. So I'm going to have to read this because Dr. Chris Stout was deemed an international rock star by the American Psychological Association. I can't wait to ask him what the hell that means. That's great. He's a clinical psychologist. He's a philanthropist. He's the founder of the Center for Global Initiatives. He's the vice president of research and data analytics for ATI. Dr. Chris Stout has done everything from helping organizations succeed to being a best-selling author, speaker, to founding a kindergarten for orphan children in Tanzania. Oh, what am I going to do today? I think I'm going to open an orphanage in Tanzania. Chris, welcome to Exploring Different Brains.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hackie. It's great to be here.
Well, let me tell you, this is a big honor for me. It's not often I even hear of people like you. It's like amazing, all this stuff.
Well, you're very kind. I mean, it takes one to know one, my friend.
You're too kind. Now, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience the way you would?
Well, thank you. It's good to be on your show. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, 30 some odd years ago. Prior to that, also have a undergrad degree in architecture and kind of came from very humble upbringing. Divorced folks, lived with my mom first part of my childhood in urban Dallas, and lived with my dad second half of my childhood and adolescence on a rural farm. And I think sort of all those things maybe kind of came together to teach me a lot of different kinds of things, but certainly gave me an interest in winding up in psychology and then looking to see how I can apply psychology from the clinical side, the humanitarian side, and the research side to various and sundry kinds of problems.
So at what point did you realize that it's all about the brain?
Gosh, probably in undergrad. The classes that I took had a like the traditional kinds of things. You'd learn Freudian, you'd learn Jungian, you'd learn behavioral, you'd learn this and that, Skinner and whatnot. But I took a comparative psychology course where we actually ablated different parts of rats' brains and saw what kinds of impacts that had. And then I really sort of had this appreciation of the mind-body interconnection and looking at how I remember this wonderful cartoon that said nature, nurture, or anybody's guess. And I always felt it was sort of a combination of those kinds of things, because regardless of upbringing, regardless of conditioning, there's still always going to be the impact of systems, and the brain, obviously in that instance, upon how people process information, upon how people emotionally experience things, and how they develop their relationships.
Tell me your impression, based on what you just said, of the gut-brain connection.
Well, I am feeling like I'm kind of on a trajectory of getting education about that a lot more than I used to. I was at a conference last year and learned for the first time, I'm embarrassed to say, I never heard this in graduate school, that like something like in the neighborhood of 80% of serotonin is produced in the gut. I always sort of presumed it was not in the gut if anywhere. So, and I've been reading a variety of things just as recently as yesterday about the impact of the microbiome and impact of diet and impact of probiotics and things like that on managing not just things that people would think like IBD or something, but also psychological and emotional kinds of issues, anxiety.
Yeah, I was amazed when I started learning. I interviewed Derek McFabe from up in Canada, who's one of the world's pioneers in gut-brain. And it was an amazing journey to start learning about that, how I think a New York Times article, they quoted my old classmate Tom Insel, who used to be director of the National Institute of Mental Health, as saying, the flora in your gut says more about the wiring of your brain than your genes. It's like the fecal transplants. It was a whole amazing thing. And then a light went on in my brain that, you know what? it's all of these factors, that many of which you can control, really affect the neuroplasticity and your ability to rewire. And it's become my opinion, which is why I started differentbrains.org, that all of these different entities, whether you call mental health issues or neurological issues or developmental issues, from Alzheimer's to autism and everything in between, all the same tools seem to have a profound effect, whether it's exercise, a good plant-based kind of diet, socialization, the most underrated thing, good relationships, and diet, nutrition, activity, socialization. It's not brain surgery, but it does affect your brain.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you raise an interesting point, because I think oftentimes in graduate programs or medical school that people become very reductionistic, and we like to have real simple, black, white, A-B kinds of relationships. And it's sort of like the proverbial cliche of the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. But I feel more hopeful to the points that you just made in terms of a more interdisciplinary, cross-collaborative kind of perspective of looking at all these kinds of body systems. Before, there used to be sort of this dichotomy with psychology was the non-medical version of psychiatry and vice versa. And now I think, when you look at pediatrics, we look at oncology, you look at gastroenterology, all these kinds of things, we see the combined effect and impact that it has on behavior and mood.
Right, and as an MD, I can tell you I got zero training in that, and I hope the worm is turning now. Now I'm going to segue here a little bit, because on the site for the Center for Global Initiatives, I just want to read this. This caught my eye because the last guy I heard talk like this was a way back. I took a 2-week course in Washington, D.C. in orthopedic pathology when I was still in medical school by a guy named Lent Johnson, who was an iconoclast. And he was head of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. And he saw the whole prism of the world like this. I'm quoting from, on the site for the center, a quote, "Health is perhaps the most common denominator in a region's potential for success, as it is so intertwined with economic sustainability, eradicating poverty, preventing war, mitigating violence, and fostering social prosperity." Can you expound upon that in terms of acceptance of mental health and everything we're talking about here?
There is a fellow, Jordan Caslow, who is a ophthalmologist, and he was really sort of the inspiration of that perspective on my part. And one of the things that he talked about was looking at this is sort of really, again, being holistic in a different way. We talked about just now being holistic and looking at a person as a system. But when you look at cultures and you look at regions and you look at places in the world that are hot spots, they're systems as well too. And oftentimes the socially disenfranchised, the marginalized, the abused, the stigmatized are those that have mental health kinds of issues. Oftentimes there's very little empathy, and this isn't just to developing places. This is here in North America. It's unfortunately it's a global issue. Some places are more accepting and more open than others. Some people are more accepting and open than others. But I had worked at the United Nations 1998, 1999, and one of the things that I worked on was the aspect of looking at mental health and substance abuse vis-a-vis sustainable development. And sort of the argument or the thesis that I had in that, which relates back to the quote that you very generously used, was that if without mental health there is no health, so to speak. That issues of you can be needing this kind of assistance regardless of whatever kind of circumstance you're in, and if you're not getting that, it's going to be hard to be a good parent. It's going to be hard to be a good worker. It's going to be hard to be a good contributor to your community or to your tribe or whatever. And it makes it really, ironically, I think, a fundamental aspect of being successful in every other aspect of one's life. Even if you're, biologically, so to speak, or physically fit or healthy. If you are suffering with debilitating chronic clinical depression, you're not going to be able to go work. You're not going to be able to support a family, things like that. So that's the kind of aspect of what that point was trying to get to.
What was your inspiration in getting into this whole arena of psychology and brain? And also, I don't know if it's related to this, but I suspect it is in your case. How did you expand your circles of concern to include the whole world?
Oh gosh, you have good questions. I guess for me, back to grad and undergrad, it was just intellectual curiosity, wondering how things tick, what makes if you look at the positive psychology kind of thing, what helps people to be happy and productive and energetic and good partners and good parents, etc. And the pathology side of it, what goes haywire, what are the kinds of things that could be avoided and prevented, what are the kinds of things that could be mitigated, what are the kinds of things that have opportunity to have clinical impact and improvement on. So in my line of thought, I really can't separate, the behavioral from the biological, the emotional from the brain, so to speak. So again, I just saw that as being very synthetic, very interwoven, very part and parcel of one another. For the global part of it, I've written in places that I kind of refer to myself as being an accidental humanitarian. Kind of a Mr. Magoo, if you will, sort of walking off of one I-beam and fortunately landing on another one. Because I would love to sit here and tell you, I had this great plan, this great trajectory. It was very linear. I was going to do A and then B and then C and then D. And it wasn't that way at all. When I started off as a first-year graduate student, I imagined myself as working with adults as outpatients, and by the time I finished, I was working with children as inpatients. So it was a totally different kind of thing because along the line, it was good to have a plan and a trajectory, but I found other things that I found more satisfying and enjoyable and good work. The same with the humanitarian sphere. Through the World Economic Forum and through flying doctors, going on a mission and doing other kinds of things with other people who became friends, it just sort of pulled me into that area. I mean, honestly, the genesis of starting the center was based upon a climb that I had done 15 years earlier in Tanzania with a fellow that I met that was working his way through seminary as a porter, and he and I kept in touch, and one thing led to another. He was a friend. I wanted to help him out, and one of the results of helping him out was helping to form the kindergarten that you mentioned in the intro. So I didn't plan that. I didn't, it wasn't on my goals and bucket list. It just organically evolved by virtue of having a friend in need and me having some other friends on this stateside that were able to be of help.
So you have global ADHD, and you're
it's a dose of OCD probably too.
Yeah, but you're a dot connector. You connect all the dots, and when you meet somebody new, you connect that dot to your already existing universe. That's tremendous. I was very hearing what you said. There used to be this dichotomy between the medical field and the psychological field, that the psychologists don't have to know the anatomy and everything. Now, my daughter Rebecca, who's my hero, who's inspired the movies and books and everything, who's 35, she, to go along with her discrete math degree from Georgia Tech, she's about halfway or 2/3 of the way through her master's in applied psychology. And one of her favorite courses, I don't think existed way back then, which was biopsychology, where you correlate every one of these behaviors to the anatomical centers. And now with the modern scans, you can see them light up and everything. So that, gulf has been crossed now. And now I think there's better communication between a psychologist such as yourself and the organizations, and what I hope is going on between them and the MD community and psychiatrists and neuroscientists.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're spot on. I mean, there's, I think, a much more appreciation with programs and things that are looking at the impact of neuroscience. There's I'm not conversant in it at all, I'm just aware of it, that looking at neuroscience support for psychoanalytic theory, which I think was, sort of revolutionary. And I think your point about, kind of building bridges, if you think about the biopsychosocial aspects, I think it gets to your earlier point of the whole, that role of culture and social aspect to it as well. And we see psychologists working in medical settings, elbow to elbow with different kinds of specialists and nurses and whatnots around treating oncology patients, etc. I just saw a headline in Medscape yesterday that talked about brain imaging and determining who's going to be a good surgeon. I thought, wow, that's an amazing application of that. So I think, again, just the more that we start to learn, the more we see maybe creative applications of diagnostic tools and things, the more we're going to, make better decisions and be more informed about how to create change.
Well, Dr. Chris Stout, you're pretty amazing. Now, you're one of the few people I've met who actually worked in the UN. What's the biggest thing somebody like me has no clue about the UN?
I have an ambivalent love-hate relationship with the UN. I work with a colleague, Harvey Langholtz, who's a social psychologist at the College of William and Mary. And he had a very in-depth relationship with the United Nations. This was back when Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, and she was kind of his boss while he was there. And there's I did not know this, to my surprise, there is a perpetual position at the United Nations for someone in the military, which almost seems a little oxymoronic, but he was from what I think is sort of like the kinder and gentler military, which was the Coast Guard. So it seemed very fitting for that. So he and I got together. He had written a book called The Psychology of Peacekeeping. We got together and wrote a book called The Psychology of Diplomacy. And again, the work that I had done was looking at, if in the diplomatic scenario of looking at sustainability, and now this was late 90s, so there weren't millennium goals yet, but now what we see in the millennium goals of the kinds of things where psychology and behavioral kinds of issues and mental health kinds of issues can have a seat at the table and have an impact. So those are the positive kinds of things. That's my love side of that equation. The hate's too strong a word, but the frustrations is that the United Nations, like a lot of other large bureaucratic complex systems, are very slow to move. There's a lot of politics there, as you can imagine, as there is in any other kind of large institutional circumstance. And it makes it very frustrating for people like myself and the colleagues I was working with to feel like you felt like you're making very incremental change. It was going in the right direction, but it was, you become very impatient after a while to try and see the kinds of things that seem so obvious and have great agreement, but the application in terms of being able to make significant change was a Sisyphean, if that's a word, kind of challenge. It just, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back.
Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus. That's a good analogy. The analogies to the aircraft carrier taking 3 months to turn 10 degrees. I used to make that analogy when, I was an orthopedic surgeon and then started recruiting the best people I could find from around the country, and we ultimately ended up with like 5 offices in 3 counties, and we were acquired by a publicly traded company, and I stayed on as CEO for a couple of years, but it was amazing that the stuff you could get done as like a PT boat, throw it in reverse, shoot a torpedo. But man, when you get in those big bureaucratic things, it's just going to have to turn and drive you crazy. And meanwhile, people are suffering and injustices go on and things of that nature.
Well, that's one of the things we talk about on our website is one of my most inspirational books by a economist, William Easterly, and he's kind of one of my heroes. And he wrote a book kind of playing off the title of White Man's Burden. And in that book, he talks about the problems of large bureaucratic systems, whatever they might be, to affect change in a quick kind of way, and really supported and fostered the idea of smaller, more agile, more guerrilla, if you will, kinds of NGOs, nonprofits, people working as individuals, people working together in groups to be able to create change. And proverbial, saving that starfish on the beach, as opposed to maybe you can't save all of them, but you made a difference in the impacting the one that you did save.
Care to tell us more about your family and children?
Sure, I'd love to. My wife Karen and I just celebrated our 32nd anniversary, so that's wonderful and great fun. She's also a clinical psychologist. We met in graduate school. I have two children. My son is 22 years old and finishing up his undergrad in statistics at University of Illinois. And my daughter is 19 and finishing up her sophomore year at the Business Honors Program at University of Illinois.
Why don't you tell our audience how they learn more about you? How do you get in touch with you? What are some of the places they can go?
I would be happy to be of help. Probably the easiest portal to a variety of other kinds of links is my website, which is simply Dr. Chris Stout, no punctuation, .com. So just drchrisStout.com, and there's a way to put in a thing in there to be able to email me. You'll see links to I blog on LinkedIn, so there'll be links to LinkedIn, and people can read about some of the things I do there. I curate a lot of information on LinkedIn, so the kinds of things I was just now talking about. I mean, I did a piece probably about a month and a half ago on biohacking, where I talk a lot about biome and whatnot. So that would probably be the easiest, but once you get in there, then it's kind of a person's choice. I've got a channel on YouTube, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. Our center is centerforglobalinitiatives.org. We have a lot of free tools and resources and downloadable books and chapters there. And I just launched about 2 months ago a podcast myself. So it's called Living a Life in Full, and it's on iTunes. And we have a website for that too that you can link in through the drchrisStout.com site.
What is that podcast about?
It's about everything. I kind of refer to it as a kind of like a podcast magazine. So it's things that right now, as I guess a number of podcasts start off with, it's I'm interviewing colleagues of mine, friends of mine, that I think have done some amazing kinds of things. So I'm a runner, so the very first show is on two physical therapists who, one's a marathoner, the other's an ultra marathoner, and talking about avoiding injury and coming back from injury, and how do you even start a mile run if you've never run before, etc. Most recently, this show's not up yet, it's in post-production, but it's a wonderful young man named Colin O'Brady. And Colin is known for doing something called Project 7-2, and that means that he has climbed the 7 summits, the tallest mountain on each continent. I've done 3, he's done 7. I did the easy ones, and he's done all of them, the major ones. And then he went, because that wasn't enough, to the North and South Pole. He was the youngest person to do that, and he did them all in 139 days. So I encourage people to listen. Not every episode might not be someone's cup of tea, but I guarantee you that there's going to be something interesting and definitely inspirational in every episode.
Is there anything, Chris, that we did not cover that you'd like to cover or talk about or get information out about to our audience?
I think you've done a good covering of the waterfront. The only thing I would add is just I would encourage people that if you have that itch that you want to scratch of being helpful or contributing or doing something in the world, there's a lot of need out there, and I would encourage people to not put that off. I used to talk about what I called the pox of the untils. Oftentimes people will wait until they lose 5 pounds, or until they graduate school, or until they get divorced, or until they get married, or until they retire. And then all of a sudden, they've squandered what could be a wonderful, enriched life by virtue of just putting things off. So I would just encourage people to get out there, take a first step, try something out. If it works, terrific, congratulations. If it doesn't, try something different, and look to resources that are out there to be able to help do it. Part of the reason for our center is to say it shouldn't be so hard to do good work in the world. So part of what we do is to try to take some of that pain in the neck stuff out of it and provide a lot of free resources and tools for people to be able to use.
Well, Dr. Chris Stout, humanitarian, psychologist, rock star of international psychology, global leader. We thank you so much for spending time here at Different Brains with us.
It has been a distinct pleasure, and it's my honor. Thanks so much for having me.
Exploring Different Brains is a production of Different Brains, Inc. For more information, visit us at differentbrains.org.